you spare me over till another year? Well, what is this that I can't see with ice cold hands taking hold of me? Well, I am death, no one can tell. I'll open the gate to heaven or hell. Oh, death, someone would pray. Could you wait to call me another day? My mother came to my bed, placed a cold towel upon my head. Well, my head is warm, my feet are cold. Death is a-moving up on my soul. Oh, death, how you treating me? You close my eyes till I can't see. You're hurting my body, you're making me cold. You run my life right out of my soul. Oh, death, please consider my age. Don't take me at this stage. My wealth is all at your command, if you will move your icy hands. Oh, the young, the rich or poor, all alike me you know. No wealth, no land, no silver or gold, nothing satisfies me but your soul. Oh, death, whoa, death, won't you spare me over till another year? Won't you spare me over till another year? It's so hard for me to sit back here in this studio looking at a guy out here hollering my name when last year I spent more money on spilt liquor and bars from one side of this world to the other than you made. You're talking to the Rolex wearing, diamond ring wearing, kiss stealing, woo, wheeling, dealing, limousine riding, jet plane flying, son of a gun. My shoes are worth more money than your house, and I'm having a hard time keeping these alligators down. Woo! This part of the service was brought to you by Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. And now, it's time for the offering. All right, folks. You spent more money in spilt liquor than some people make in a year. What are we going to put in the plate here? Let's see. Let's just put it all in there, shall we? Okay. Oh, there. Let's see what we have here. We've got 2 5s, a 20, a quarter, a dime, a pocket knife, some toenail clippers. It's pretty hard around here today since there's only 3 of us, so we may have to pass this plate twice next week. Lord, bless these offerings, that they may serve your world. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. What a lonesome place we're in. There's 2 people here. There's no organ, there's no music. Luckily we have power, so there's a little bit of a hum from the air conditioning. But here we are. So hopefully you're at home, you're safe, you're warm, and you're here joining us online to share in whatever message we can come up with for you all this morning. And now it's time for the children's sermon. All you little children out there, please gather around. All right, settle down, children. I'm going to read you all a passage from a book or a set of books called The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And this is in the final book of that series. I think it was 7 books total. And things are drawing to a close. So here's his tale. "Further up and further in," cried Jewel, and instantly they were off again. They were out of Narnia now, and up into the western wild, which neither Tyrion nor Peter nor even the eagle had ever seen before. But the Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly had. "Do you remember? Do you remember?" they said, and said it in steady voices too, without panting, though the whole party was now running faster than an arrow flies. So they ran faster and faster, till it was more like flying than running. And even the eagle overhead was going no faster than they. And they went through winding valley after winding valley, and up the steep sides of the hills, and faster than ever down the other sides, following the river and sometimes crossing it and skimming across the mountain lakes as if they were living speedboats, till at last at the far end of one long lake, which looked as blue as a turquoise, they saw a smooth green hill. Its sides were as steep as the sides of a pyramid, and round the very top of it ran a green wall. But above the wall rose the branches of trees whose leaves looked like silver and their fruit like gold. Only when they had reached the very top did they slow up. That was because they found themselves facing great golden gates, and for a moment none of them was bold enough to try if the gates would open. They all felt just as they had felt about the fruit. Dare we? Is it right? Can it be meant for us? But while they were standing thus, a great horn, wonderfully loud and sweet, blew from somewhere inside that walled garden, and the gates swung open. Tyrion stood holding his breath and wondering who would come out. And what came out was the last thing he had expected. A little, sleek, bright-eyed, talking mouse with a red feather stuck in a circlet on its head, and its left paw resting on a long sword. And it bowed, a most beautiful bow, and said in its shrill voice, "Welcome in the lion's name. Come further up and further in." Then Tyrion saw King Peter and King Edmund and Queen Lucy rush forward to kneel down and greet the mouse, and they cried out, "Reap-a-cheep!" And Tyrion breathed fast with the sheer wonder of it. For now he knew that he was looking at one of the great heroes of Narnia, Reap-a-cheep the mouse, who had fought at the great battle of Baruna and afterwards sailed to the world's end with King Caspian the seafarer. But before he had had much time to think of this, he felt 2 strong arms thrown about him and felt a bearded kiss on his cheeks and heard a well-remembered voice saying, "What, lad, art thicker and taller since I last touched thee?" It was his own father, the good King Urlian, but not as Tyrion had seen him last when they brought him home pale and wounded from his fight with the giant, nor even as Tyrion remembered him in his later years when he was a gray-headed warrior. This was his father, young and merry, as he could just remember him from very early days when he himself had been a little boy playing games with his father in the castle garden, just before bedtime on summer evenings. The very smell of the bread and milk he used to have for supper came back to him now. But by now the mouse was again urging them to come in, so all of them passed in through the golden gates into the delicious smell that blew towards them out of that garden and into the cool mixture of sunlight and shadow under the trees. Walking on springy turf that was all dotted with white flowers, The very first thing which struck everyone was that the place was far larger than it had seemed from outside. But no one had time to think about that, for people were coming up to meet the newcomers from every direction. Now, I've skipped through a lot of this in parts, trying to boil it down. Old acquaintances, old family members, and friends were all there to greet them. And young Lucy, who, if you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you may remember, she started talking to her oldest Narnian friend, the Fawn Tumnus. And as they commented on the size of the place, she said, "I see," she said at last, thoughtfully, "I see now. This garden is like the stable. It is far bigger inside than it was outside." "Of course, daughter of Eve," said the fawn. "The further up and the further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside." Lucy looked hard at the garden and saw that it was not really a garden at all, but a whole world. So you young children, if you're out there listening to that, if you haven't read the Chronicles of Narnia, ask your parents to get it, or go to a library and see if you can get all, I think it was all 7 books. It's worth your read. Well, so we are in church, quiet as it is. And the scripture passage for today was Romans 8, verses 5 through 17. I'm not going to read that because we got important stuff to get to here. And so I'll let you read that on your own time. Everybody should have a little homework. I will briefly mention this one short passage out of it. I think it says it's verse 10. "But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness." Well, I don't know how Ric Flair or a children's story or a snowstorm or even how Romans chapter 8, I can't really tell you too much about how that all relates to death. But let me talk to you a little bit about it, at least what I've come to think about it. So I titled this, "Do You Fear Death?" Now, sticking with C.S. Lewis, who wrote many different areas or genres in his life, he also wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters, where a senior demon named Screwtape writes letters to his, I think it was his nephew maybe, my dear Wormwood, who was a junior demon being coached along by Screwtape. And references in here, when the word enemy, he's talking about God. And this was setting during the World War. In chapter 28, he writes, "My dear Wormwood, when I told you not to fill your letters with rubbish about the war, I meant, of course, that I did not want to have your rather infantile rhapsodies about the death of men and the destruction of cities. Insofar as the war really concerns the spiritual state of the patient, I naturally want full reports. And on this aspect, you seem singularly obtuse. Thus you tell me with glee that there is reason to expect heavy air raids on the town where the creature lives. This is a crying example of something I have complained about already. Your readiness to forget the main point in your immediate enjoyment of human suffering. Do you not know that bombs kill men? Or do you not realize that the patient's death at this moment is precisely what we want to avoid? He has escaped the worldly friends with whom you tried to entangle him. He has fallen in love with a very Christian woman and is temporarily immune from your attacks on his chastity. And the various methods of corrupting his spiritual life which we have been trying are so far unsuccessful. At the present moment, as the full impact of the war draws nearer and his worldly hopes take a proportionately lower place in his mind, full of his defense work, full of the girl, forced to attend to forced to attend to his neighbors more than he has ever done before, and liking it more than he expected. Taken out of himself, as the humans say, and daily increasing in conscious dependence on the enemy. He will almost certainly be lost to us if he is killed tonight. This is so obvious that I am ashamed to write it. I sometimes wonder if you young fiends are not kept out on temptation duty too long at a time, if you are not in some danger of becoming infected by the sentiments and values of the humans among whom you work. They, of course, do tend to regard death as the prime evil and survival as the greatest good. But that is because we have taught them to do so. Do not let us be infected by our own propaganda. I know it seems strange that your chief aim at the moment should be the very same thing for which the patient's lover and his mother are praying, namely his bodily safety. But so it is. You should be guarding him like the apple of your eye. If he dies now, you lose him. Death is a strange thing. I don't recall too many sermons I've heard on death. Lots of them on love and love your neighbor and do something nice for somebody and don't be ugly and things like that. But it's not a lot to be said about death. Even funerals, a lot of them, it seems like the general story is remembering the good times. So what happens at death? What is it about death that is so scary? What are you going to lose in death? I think we fear losing our loved ones. I think that is common amongst all people, Christians and just everybody. We don't want to lose our loved ones. Here's another little excerpt. This is from Marcus Aurelius in Book 10 on his Meditations, where he's discussing being separated from one's loved ones at death. He writes, "For it was nature that knit and kneaded thee with them, and now she parts the tie. I am parted as from kinsfolk, not dragged forcibly away, but going unresistingly. For this severance too is a process of nature." In Book 4, he says, "Death, like birth, is a secret of nature, a combination of the same elements, a breaking up into the same, and not at all a thing, in fact, for any to be ashamed of, for it is not out of keeping with an intellectual creature or the reason of his equipment. And as a general conclusion, call this to mind, that within a very short time both thou and he will be dead. And a little later, not even your names will be left behind you." Death is so often equated with loss. But I wonder if we can examine it from a different angle. Like, what's gained in death? Death is coming for us all. You cannot escape it. Death is going to take you and every single one of the people you love, both your ancestors and your descendants. If you consider that life is a journey, exploring this earth and exploring it with people, it becomes clear that the loss of living as we know it is what we fear we will lose in death. See, birth has already come for us all. It is relatively straightforward for the baby. A baby will be born sometime around about 9 months after conception, and with a few exceptions, and I'm sure there's some doctors out there that are going to say, what about this and that? In general, just trying to boil it down, we all came into existence through our mothers. What I'm driving at is that there's only one way into this world, and it's from within your mother. But once you have air in your lungs, you are born and on your way, and everyone's path is different from that point forward. If you're lucky, you have a nice childhood. Some are born into families where they might have to struggle. Some are born with the proverbial silver spoon in their mouths, whether they realize it or not. And then there are some that are born into a world where they're never wanted to begin with. And some who are born into families, and for whatever reason, they will have to face abuse and pain and suffering. And sometimes that suffering and abuse will scar them for the rest of their lives. But we're all born, and we all start down a path. And once you're through the infant stage, you're marching on into your toddler years and your childhood and your adolescence. And it's a marvel to think about how many firsts we experience during that time. It's a time that I hope that you all look back on fondly and reminisce about being a time in your life when you didn't have to worry about anything and maybe you had no fears at all. But as time and space each go on, the differences between each of us continue to grow exponentially. Maybe you can think of it as the universe expanding, everything getting further apart. And we each, through our own experiences, we get further away from each other, and sometimes we gather around others. That is why classmates share some experiences in common, but probably not as many as, say, two neighborhood children who grew up together. And even they, too, they won't have as many commonalities as two siblings. Perhaps you and a sibling, you went to the same places for the first time at the same time. And you shared that experience. Yes, life is a journey that we, at times, take with others. And sometimes we know exactly where we are on that journey. And other times, we might feel lost. Have you ever been lost? Maybe in a new town trying to find your destination and not being familiar with the roads. Have you ever been lost in the woods where you slightly walk off the path? I know Alex and I went to Skyline Drive right after the leaves had fallen, and we walked down a path that was well worn except for the fact that the leaves were covering it. There were a few times, he might not remember it, but there were a few times that I was a little concerned, are we on the path here, or are we getting ready to walk into somewhere we shouldn't be? But we made it out. Now, have you ever been lost in the woods in the pitch black dark at night? That's lost. Let me tell you about that. When I was young, I hunted deer with my dad and his friend Mike Pereira, who had a farm near where I grew up. And there's a creek that runs from Mike's farm and runs behind my dad's house past the old family farm. And it's about a mile in between of mostly woods. And so as long as you walk near the creek, you're going to come out on a field on one end or the other. So you can't get lost in there, okay? Now, if my dad had to work, but I was off from school, I would sometimes walk to meet Mike and go hunting. And on days like that, I'd strike out while it was still dark, down the back of the field and across the hedgerow, across the neighbor's cow pasture, and then I would cut into the woods about maybe 100, 200 yards off the creek because it was full of briars right there. I was sort of cutting around, making it easier for myself. And I would just angle towards the creek, and on I went. And I just keep moving up further in and further along the creek. And eventually those woods would thin out. There's a beautiful bottom I can still see where the hillsides came down and the woods were open, and it was just a picturesque scene. And I would keep moving past that, and pretty soon the sun would be coming up at my back, and I'd pop out into the back field at Mike's farm, and we'd hunt all day, usually do a little work too. And then I'd head home for the evening and make the trek back again with the setting sun at my back. And it was often dark and a little bit scary, but I had my shotgun in my hand, so I was willing to take my chances. It didn't take long before I knew the lay of the land around home. I could recognize where I was, and I could make my way through any piece of woods. It was familiar. And even if it got dark, I felt like I knew where I was heading. Now then, as life tends to happen, we stopped hunting around home, and eventually Mike passed away. And soon enough, my dad and we started to hunt with a hunt club in Cumberland County on the Willis River. And the scenery there was similar, but the blocks of woods were very different. They didn't have that familiar feel of what I had become accustomed to at home. The creeks didn't run from farm to farm. They just seemed to keep running on forever into the woods. And as a young man, I was in the woods one day, trailing a deer towards dark. And darkness set in, and I didn't know where I was. And that was, I believe, the first time, maybe the only time, I've ever been lost in the woods in the pitch black dark and didn't know how to get out. And they were big blocks of wood, so in my mind, I could just keep walking forever and they'd find me a couple years later. But I made my way out, and now I take my son to that same property to hunt. And we often walk through that same block of woods, but it has become much more familiar through the years. Let's get back to the path of life. There are so many different paths we take, and there's so many side paths that we each take from time to time, and we meet different people on them. Sometimes we'll make a friendship that will endure, and sometimes it will just be a fleeting moment. Sometimes we might even get lost in a new block of woods, and sometimes we will come to know the new until it has become the familiar. Time marches on, and soon young adulthood comes, and the nuclear option is dropped on the nuclear family. Some parents hope their kids will leave, some parents dread it, but nevertheless, time moves forward and farther along. And perhaps marriage is entered into, and then you endeavor to share a subset of experiences with one person who you think you love, and you know they will never do any wrong, and they would never change from the beautiful person you fell in love with, right? Maybe. Wait a minute. Your beloved spouse, who was so handsome or so beautiful when you first met, now suddenly seems like they have become a different person? You didn't marry this slob, or you didn't marry a fat guy, or maybe, oh hell, you didn't marry a Democrat, or didn't marry a Republican. But all of a sudden, you wake up one day and you don't recognize the person you chose to be married to. But time goes on and life goes on. And some people will divorce. Some will remarry. Some will stay married. And our interconnections of life just continue to intertwine with others. But regardless of which paths we choose, we all must keep moving further up and further in. Somewhere along the path of life, something happens. I think it happens to all of us. I don't know. But to some, I think it's a tidal wave or a seismic event. And for others, I think it's more of a gradual wearing away and an erosion. And you don't notice it until it's long since happened. But age starts to pass us by, and we realize that our youth was left in the past some time ago. And death is no longer unknowable. From the moment of birth all the way through, folks are dropping out of the marching line. And it seems the earlier they fall out of the line, the sadder we are. You know, we were told that we must stay apart to prevent infection, to prevent death. And I suppose we have done that. And now many people are stopping and taking stock of what path they find themselves on. And many are changing paths. Some believe that masks would stop the devil himself. And some believe that masks were sent by the devil himself. And I think that's where a lot of our churches are right now. A lot of people we all stopped. We all are standing on the path and looking at those around us that are on the same or a nearby path, and we're trying to figure out if it's a path we want to be on. The difficult part is we all want to try to look forward and figure out what's to come. Steve Jobs, remember last week I mentioned the iPhone. He delivered the commencement speech at Stanford in 2005. It's been viewed countless times. It's very inspirational. You should check it out if you have never seen it. And in that speech, I remember he shared some stories from his life, and he talked about connecting the dots and how it's impossible to connect the dots looking forward. But only when you're able to look backwards are you able to connect the dots. I think we are walking in a path in life that's heading somewhere. We're all on different paths. Some of our paths cross. Sometimes we share paths with others, and sometimes they diverge. But just as we all came into this world through one means, all of our paths are heading to a convergence at the gate. And what is required of us is to keep moving down the path, to love those that we encounter, to try not to do evil, to try to meet new people and be open to what they have to say. And sometimes we're going to be lost, and sometimes we're going to be alone. But we are all moving further up and further in, and eventually we all will leave the path. We all will get to the end. And we are all heading up the hill to the gates at the garden. That's all I have to say about that. Not your traditional service. I came in last night at 6 o'clock and I played the organ mercilessly with passion and fervor. Harold, if you're watching, hope I didn't break it. Just kidding. I couldn't play the organ. I know nothing about it. Not very musical. But nevertheless, let's see if we can close out with a little song about we're sitting here, three of us, and you're sitting in your home, I guess. Maybe you're at a bar having a beer watching this. I don't know. That'd be good too. But we're all a little bit more lonesome today. Snow's falling. Maybe. Can't see out the windows. But this song always touches us something deep down about life's path and when things get lonely. Hear that lonesome whippoorwill. He sounds too blue to fly. The midnight train is whining low. I'm so lonesome I could cry. I've never seen a night so long when time goes crawling by. The moon just went behind the clouds to hide its face and cry. Did you ever see a robin weep when leaves begin to die? That means he's lost the will to live. I'm so lonesome I could cry. The silence of a falling star lights up a purple sky. And as I wonder where you are, I'm so lonesome I could cry. Folks, thank you for joining us, and just remember when you're walking down life's path, you can always do it styling and profiling. Woo!